Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Saeed. I'm a research analyst here, and I will be your host for today's episode, which takes stock of developments in the climate finance space, particularly with reference to the upcoming COP30 in Brazil and some of the developments in India as well. Scaling climate finance and making it more affordable is high on the agenda of policymakers across the world. Climate finance was at the forefront of COP29, where the new collective quantified goal on climate finance was adopted, and the figures of 300 billion and 1.3 trillion were introduced after much negotiation. And since then, 2025 has thrown up some of its own challenges, with the US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement and revoking its International Climate Finance Plan. US aid funding is also vaporized, and we are seeing trends among European states as well, following the same cue. But alongside these developments, there are also conversations which have continued, and recently we saw two important conferences. One was the Finance for Development Conference in Sevilla, and the other, the Climate Talks in Bonn this June. So to discuss these developments in this landscape in the run-up to COP30, we are delighted to be joined by Ms Aarti Khosla, founder and director at Climate Trends.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you so much for joining us. So just to start off our conversation, I think I mentioned in the introduction that the discussions on climate finance haven't stopped, and the Development for Finance conference in Sevilla, for instance, called for provisions and mobilization of means of implementation of the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC objectives. And so there's been like this establishing this link between development and climate finance. So I was just wondering how you see these developments feeding into the upcoming COP30 summit in Brazil.
Well, the COP in Belém is happening at a very dramatic time. At no point in the recent history have there been such reconfigurations in the fundamental assumptions in how politics is being seen. The issue of tariffs has completely put a lot of discussions upside down. Climate as such has not just been quite an important geopolitical negotiating tool, it's also something that plays a lot into realpolitik, because eventually it is how people get impacted and how funds get raised, how banks will mobilize money to for worthy projects and so on and so forth. So whenever we talk about climate finance, it just feels like a lot comes into the mix. A lot of issues get conflated, and as such, it's always the elephant in the room. When we ended the COP in Baku, the nerves were quite raw, and yet there was a commitment to have $300 billion mobilized by 2035 and to have a target of 1.3 trillion. Now, I think for this year, the task is quite cut out, at least to be able to define quite clearly of what the 300 billion is made up of. Will it include concessional finance? Will it include money that the multilateral development banks can put forward? Will it include the provision of some kind of public finance as the basis, so that on top of it you can then add private capital? So there is a lot of this conversation that must happen before Belém, but like it is for every finance conversation, there is a lot of clarity that is needed. There is a lot of breaking down of complex information. And to that extent, it's also difficult and unfair, I think, to a certain extent, to just pin hopes for a big outcome on matters like finance on one COP alone. So I think Belém should be, as long as Belém moves in the right direction, that itself is progress.
I think you rightly highlighted that the geopolitical environment right now feeds into this kind of, from what we're seeing in this fracturing multilateralism and American retreat from a lot of the economic systems, and there is this kind of wave of economic nationalism within policies in countries. So putting that at the front, with COP30, what are like some of the expectations of because there are these discussions of it being the COP of implementation, although this is not a new term and a lot of previous meetings have sort of used that. So are there any, in terms of expectations, what do we get out of COP30?
I think Brazilian government put out some letters over the last few months, and few things, how they have said it, eventually boil down to forests, finance, and fossil fuels. And I think they are trying to evaluate the outcomes of the COP when it comes to all of these three criteria. We already saw there was an announcement from China a couple of weeks ago that they will be making a contribution to the Tropical Forest Fund. If something like that happens, I think it really tips the balance in favor of how China is already looking at climate finance, not just in the traditional way of polluters having the responsibility to pay, but coming up as one of the biggest emitters of the present situation and still being in a position to pay, while, as you said, some others like US totally leaving a leadership vacuum. So I think that's one thing to watch on what happens on is there I think that's something to watch on what happens on whether there is some progress on an agreement on forests. The COP itself is happening in Amazonia, which is the heart of the Amazon forest as such. And I think it's both symbolic and optic now that it's happening in Belém to be able to have an outcome on forest. Then, as I said before, it's finance. The Baku to Belém roadmap, that's how the phrase is being used, is a report which will come out ahead of the COP. And I think it's important to watch the contents of that report. How does that analysis stack up to what the world needs in terms of some provision of finance, so that when finance is provided, it's not that 60% of it is just used to pay debt. When the 100 billion per year targets have been set since Copenhagen, I think it was also quite evident that a lot of African countries were just using the money that was coming to them to pay the debt for the money that they have borrowed before. So that's a bad vicious cycle that you need to break at some point. And I think having some good intentioned outcomes on finance will absolutely be crucial. Banks like the Asian Development Bank, I think, have indicated recently as well that at least half of their lending will be aligned or towards what can be classified as climate finance. There is more in the mix as well. That level of discussion on what the Baku to Belém roadmap looks like is important. Brazil also constituted something called the Council of Finance Ministers, and that report should also come ahead of the COP, because it's true as well that while climate finance is important to be discussed at the COP, because it's finance and its provision of money and its mobilization of resources and capital, the meatier discussions must also happen at other venues, including the G20, G7, the Finance Ministers Forum, etc. So therefore, the Circle of Finance Ministers outcome is also something to be watched for. And as regards fossils, I think for those who work on the climate arguments of this subject, it's quite clear that there is a clear demand to phase out fossil fuels as early as possible and to build renewables. Now, I think when the COP happened 2 years ago in Dubai, at that time we really got some success in terms of having enshrined in the preamble and in the outcome that there will be a transition away from fossil fuels. The question at this moment is how to implement it and how to make that more real, especially at a time when countries like US are forcing others to sign deals on shale gas and oil. EU itself is looking at renewables but is also going back in some ways to gas. There is expansion that is happening in China, which is extraordinary on renewables, but still they have expanded quite a lot on coal. India has a coal pipeline. I think these are all these big emitters who are in this very crucial bind of expanding renewables on one hand, but still not being able to figure out how is it to bring down the fossil component and how to fast track it, I suppose. And I think that's the tricky conversation at Brazil, but let us see how much of that happens.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. That was quite covered a lot of the landscape of how the negotiations are framed. I do want to come back to the point that you mentioned that there's a leadership vacuum. And so this is a new context in the sense that last year, maybe at COP, countries were preparing for a US exit from the negotiations, from the framework. And this year, it will be minus the United States. And the negotiations the summit is happening in Brazil, where India has had a long history of coordinating with Brazil and other global south countries in terms of climate negotiations through the basic countries framework, the BRICS and things like that. So I was wondering what kind of a role do you see India playing at COP30 given its position on climate finance and how it features as a voice of the global south?
India has, since it did its G20 and its voice on mobilizing climate finance at Baku, it's quite clear that India wants to speak for a lot of the global south, and it has on several occasions. I think the COP in Brazil, as it happens with the backdrop of difficult situation on trade negotiations across the world, also presents a chance for some countries to come and embolden the global south offering, whatever that is. Secondly, it is very hard to also slot the world in global north and global south. There is also an element of the west and the east which we cannot forget, and the story of the growth and development of the world will actually be a lot of story that will come from the east as well as from the south. And I think India has to play these two dimensions in a good way to be able to secure not just a voice for global south in Belém and towards the next COPs, but it's also a moment for it to start talking about its own vision if it wants to host the COP in 2028. Which the Prime Minister had announced in Dubai 2 years back. And at that time, the plan was that when the second cycle of the global stocktake, which is supposed to happen in 2028, will happen, the COP33 was what India had pitched for. So given how political the nature of all these conversations are, it's also crucial that India develops its framing towards that COP and has the ability to communicate a lot of the thinking that happens in the country. I think we had made a proposal as well for the 1.3 trillion and how 1.3 trillion should look. Now, if Belém is going to talk about finance, there are a lot of considerations which Indian policymakers and finance experts have very eloquently spoken about, that there should be clarity on the definition of finance, there should be a discussion on what's the scale of finance, what's the scope of finance, and what's the speed at which it is coming. These are all submissions that India has made to formal processes. And I think just looking at how to articulate these things better in terms of speaking about them at international fora and towards the lead up to them is going to be an important element of how we will be seen over there.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely right. And I do want to take this cue to draw a little bit on India's domestic climate finance landscape. Because India also has somewhat ambitious targets to reduce its emission intensity by 45% of the 2005 levels and generating 50% energy from non-fossil fuel sources. So this is happening in the face of inadequate climate financing. And like you mentioned in one of your previous answers, that the private sector is expected to sort of play a bridging role in this landscape. And to this effect, the government released recently the draft taxonomy for climate finance. So how does this step sort of change the financial landscape for climate, and sort of some of the benefits of this policy?
Sure, couple of things here. Over the last 10 years, as renewables have expanded and the share of renewables in installed capacity is quite evidently larger, it's also clear that there is an influx of private finance when it comes to these projects. On the other hand, a lot of the coal pipeline in India is still largely only funded by public sector banks in India because there is less money that is available on foreign capital, both private as well as public, to fund coal projects per se. But domestic resource mobilization is one aspect that's being realized by a lot of those who are working on the energy sector. That will be the one of the important ways in which India will meet not just its NDC targets, but as such the demands for new energy growth. Also, looking at heat stress, how much more demand for air conditioning and cooling in urban areas. It's quite clear that the energy demand is not dropping. And if the demand is only going to increase and you will need more and more energy in the mix, how is it that it can be done in a way that's also cost effective? So I think that the aspect of domestic resource mobilization is quite clearly understood. The whole aspect of how do you make projects credit worthy, or how do you make the returns better, I think is areas where there should be more work to emphasize really. If an investor is putting money and want to get a return on their investment, say over 8 to 10 years, how can you reduce that time, but how can you also increase the return on investment that they can get? Are they looking at 12%? Can you make it 16? Is it only 8? I think that level of detail should really be figured out, but can only be figured out in the whole way of doing this in a public-private partnership sort of a way, because these are not distinct questions; these are all interlinked questions, and the answers will also come in a way which is more interlinked. The second thing on finance is also this entire aspect of adaptation finance. I think more and more the realization that it is important to not have a carbon tunnel vision and to only look at outcomes which are mitigation oriented is coming to light. And India has been developing its views on the adaptation plan and how adaptation finance should look like. I think it's also a very critical aspect, just knowing how much we need to adapt. We are all watching news, we are all seeing how aspects like glacier lake outburst, floods, and changing weather patterns and monsoons becoming more as cloudburst events these days are triggering what adaptation and disaster management will have to look like. These are not things that can be ignored, and therefore whether it's private capital or it's public capital mobilizing domestic resources, that we will have to look at it, and we will have to look at it fast. On your last point about taxonomy, I think in my limited understanding of that, it's important to have a taxonomy to give clarity, while at the same time a lot of taxonomies in the world have also included fossil fuel projects, and so has India. India includes some aspects of coal development in the green taxonomy. I think to the extent that these are also discussions which are political, they are what they are, but as such, and we also don't need money through taxonomy just for green projects. Green projects are innovative new projects, will also get their own money and will get their own capital. So the answer is, what is it that taxonomy is trying to meet? And I think depending on that, just making sure that it also meets the clarity that is needed to come from a taxonomy of the fourth largest economy of the world.
Right. That's an important point, and also to your point on on adaptation financing, because we hear of a lot of the financing is specifically targeted towards the energy sector. So there probably is a need for diversification of where the result is going in terms of financing. And just before we end the conversation, I do want to touch on another policy where and what kind of a direction India is taking in terms of that, which is a carbon pricing mechanism, which are developing across the world. And so I was just wondering, what kind of an approach is India taking with its carbon pricing mechanisms?
Carbon pricing is emerging as quite an important element of how ultimately climate finance will be achieved. I think given all the components that will make up climate finance, and the fact that there is much less resources available, especially the inability of any of the countries in the world to sign a blank check these days, there have to be some kind of mechanisms, market-based, which allow for emissions to be reduced, whilst at the same time also engaging through, for instance, carbon markets. India has been talking about voluntary carbon markets, compliance carbon markets. I think we are setting our market into action by sometime mid of next year. But in the end, as long as we are not just looking at carbon markets as a way to trade credits between companies, but ultimately as a way to also reduce emissions overall, it is going to play its part. And I think to that extent, it also comes as a way to encourage a lot of companies and corporates to be able to come and contribute and take action, while at the same time be able to contribute in terms of just improving efficiencies of their processes and their businesses, but also gain something from it in having done something good. The only thing to watch out for is there are a lot of problems that carbon markets will face if the setup is not done in a way that the rules are defined clearly, the aspects of how they can be double counted by you as well as by me if we don't share that information, and as well the fact that what you're trading and what I'm trading, there is an integrity and accountability of that. So I think the rules around carbon markets are quite important to define, which is some discussion that is happening in India. But to the extent there is a market that will be in place for companies and corporates to come and take action, to that extent it is a good step in the right direction.
Thank you so much for that answer. And with that, also thank you for taking these questions, which were, I understand it was a broad spectrum across the climate landscape, finance landscape. So thank you so much for answering all the questions, and I'm sure our listeners will find them quite insightful.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you for listening. You can find more information about our work from our website, isas.nus.edu.sg. And for regular updates on our events and publications, you can find us on social media. We are available on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.